So to use an example, you might not be able to trade your cows to the vegans down the road who have the wheat that you want because they don't want your cows. So it's not universally accepted. And even more than not universally accepted, it's not universally valued, right? What is one cow worth to me versus one cow worth to Brian? Versus one cow worth to anyone else. Well, it depends a lot on what we're going to do with it, right? And so you, as a person trying to engage in barter, have a hard time valuing the exchange, right? Are you going to get what you need by only paying what you think is fair? The third thing is that when you're talking about commodity, the thing you're using to barter may have a limited lifetime. It may not hold value effectively. Cows die, wheat goes bad, pests come in and eat crops. And in many cases, this stuff is actually a pretty poor store of value because it rapidly degrades in value because of natural causes, right? So, people are generally, creative, smart problem solvers. And because this barter system was so cumbersome, people invented just a ton of different ways to represent value over time that was portable, stable, and durable. And there's actually a really fascinating history around this development that occurred all over the world in many different ways and in many different mediums. And if you're interested, it's a great area to research in more depth to discover how the various peoples around the world dealt with this problem. Because quite frankly, the breadth of creativity that they showed is really just astonishing. But the basic shape of things is people started to create some kind of a coinage system of some sort, right? So now, instead of taking your cows to the local wheat farmer to make an exchange, you could go to a central place and sell your cows to someone who would give you whatever the coin of the realm was, and then you could take those coins and exchange them for something else of value. Now, this was nice because first of all, you could take your coins to that vegan down the road, right? And instead of saying, I don't want cows, I don't eat meat, they'd say, I like money too, and sell you some wheat. Your coins aren't at risk of dying, right? If they get sick, like a cow would be, or being eaten by a pest like a crop would be. They can store value over time. And I think then what that sort of summarizing that whole thing, money does at least three things for us, or it should if it's good, sound money, right? It's an efficient method of exchange. It's portable. It's universally accepted. It's consistent as a measure of value. You don't have to quote the price of your wheat in chickens and cows and barrels of cider and whatever else. You can quote it in dollars or euros, and there's a universal sort of exchange that happens there. And lastly, it's durable, right? It's a store of value. It doesn't or shouldn't expire or dramatically fluctuate in value versus what you're using it for, right? So these are the really important characteristics of good money. So we're good, right? We're done. This is like class over. See you guys later, right? No, clearly we're not, right? Or why would we even be here in the first place? Modern money is a lot better than pure barter. But it doesn't fully solve all the issues, right? Think back to the beginning of this discussion, and was this Zimbabwean $100 trillion note a good store of value? No, it was horrible. In fact, this is another interesting topic. If you go research sort of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, they went through 4 rounds of replacing currency, trying to stabilize it before they finally gave up. So there are clearly still problems here. So let's talk about some of the problems we still have with modern money. Now, don't. I'll say this real quick. Don't cheat. Don't go read a dollar bill. But tell me, what else, other than George Washington and the number 1, right? What else appears on a dollar bill? Right? Treasury Secretary signature, in God we trust, where it was printed, serial number, and I think one of these, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. And that's a really interesting statement, right? So there are a lot of things obviously on the bill, but I think there's two things to focus on in this context. One is the seal of the Federal Reserve where the money was printed, and the legend, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Interestingly, up until 1964, we had another kind of dollar running around, and which is, to me, is super interesting. Now, first of all, take a good look at this, and then I'm going to hop to a very similar bill. I'll give you a second before I do it. Take a good look around, look at all the various pieces. When we hop, I'm going to ask you a question of what is different. Okay, here we go. Any thoughts? It's kind of some subtle difference, other than the cosmetic, right? So skip the different shade of green, and the art is different. Some subtle stuff. Let me put them side by side so that you guys can take a better look. Now, there's two core things I want to direct your attention to. First thing, the legend at the top of the bottom note reads silver certificate, and the legend at the top of the top note reads Federal Reserve note, right? And the bottom note, which is the older note, also says, if it's probably an eye chart, I don't know that you guys can necessarily read all the text there, but at the very, just below silver certificate and above the United States of America, says this certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury of America, and then you skip down $1. So what's the difference? Well, this is a very interesting and important difference for our discussion today, because it illustrates the difference between something called hard money, or money backed by hard assets, and fiat money, which is money that takes its value from a government declaration or law that assigns that value to it, right? It has value by fiat, if you will. And here's another area, by the way, where there is a super interesting vein of history that you can go research, because the linkage between the U.S. dollar and hard assets, gold and silver backing them, is really, really cool, right? So the rise and fall of the gold standard, how it relates to the U.S. dollar, and how that relates to something called the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was post-World War II agreement amongst the Allied powers. The punchline here, without spending a semester diving into U.S. history, is that the U.S. dollar up until the early 1970s was hard money, more or less. You can have pack a few economists in a room, and they can probably have an argument about whether it really was or not. But for our purposes, it was hard money, right, backed by gold. After the early 1970s, it became fiat money. Right? This is not necessarily a bad thing, and I don't want to leave you with that impression. Hard money is not universally good, and fiat money is not universally bad, right? Switching to fiat currency enabled a lot of positive outcomes, including the expansion of credit, and a lot of other things that had great sort of outcomes for the country and the world. But fiat money also creates some issues. They create issues because fiat currencies are largely built on trust, and they are centrally controlled, right? We said at the very top of this that the value of a dollar is a dollar because we all believe it's a dollar, right? That is true of fiat currencies broadly, that they are built largely on the belief that there is an entity, a government, backing it that will backstop it, not because that entity has all of that in gold and you can go redeem that dollar for $1 for the gold, but because that backing organization says it is, right? What that means is that those governments can make choices that directly impact the value and viability of a currency, right? So an example of this, and we see the one of the 500 rupee bills there on the screen, is on December 2016, India decided to ban some of the smaller denominations of its country, specifically the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes. Now, the reasons for this are complicated. Some good, some bad. I'm not saying that this was like an abuse per se, but the fact that it is possible shows you that the risks of fiat currency, right? What was once a valid piece of money yesterday, the next day is a piece of paper, right? Because that centralized authority says so. Another problem, fiat currencies are generally regionally specific, right? So someone in the Congo, right? Someone who's an entrepreneur, smart, talented, has a great idea, and wants to get online and start a business, right? So he can go, or she or they can go set up a website, set up a production facility. There are global shipping options for them to ship their product, assuming it's a physical product, their home in the Congo to anywhere else in the world. What they can't do is get paid, right? Because it is incredibly difficult to move money across borders efficiently and cheaply. All right. This is also we also see this in what's called the remittance market, which is a market where people who go to different countries to work, for example, Filipino laborers who go to Japan or the Middle East or something like that, and then want to send money back to support their families, right? Which is why they've left their country to go work, is an incredibly expensive and hard thing to do for the vast majority of people. But the third thing, we don't have a ton of transparency in how money moves through modern monetary systems, right? We can process a payment, swipe a credit card, hand over a dollar bill. We can send a wire transfer or an ACH, but what happens from there is sort of opaque to us, and we can't see, and therefore can't make judgments about exactly whether or not what's happening under the covers is fair, right? So what do we before I get into how cryptocurrency solves some of these problems, I should take a moment here and say that what I've just described to you all probably doesn't mesh with your day-to-day experience, right? In the US and a lot of countries around the world, we've had a relatively smooth experience with money. We generally trust the dollar. We can generally effectively transact with merchants. But just because we don't see problems in our everyday lives don't mean they exist, right? So cases like the Zimbabwe hyperinflation, which really only resolved in 2009, happen to this day. Another example is Venezuela, which is still in a period of extreme inflation. In many cases, citizens don't trust their government to maintain stable fiat currencies. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about how cryptocurrency can address some of these issues. So a few things. The first thing, cryptocurrency in general is not controlled, speaking of Bitcoin specifically here, is not controlled by any one person or government, right? So there's a vastly reduced chance of the rules of the game being changed out from under you. There's no one that can go say, from a network protocol level, you can't suddenly transact in this amount of money, right? It's transparent, right? So while the identities of people sending money on the blockchain with Bitcoin are not necessarily revealed to the public, the transaction patterns are, right? How much money was sent between address A and address B. And that level of transparency means that interested third parties, like us, I'm interested in that the blockchain is operating in a fair and free manner, can directly see and inspect what's going on, right? That level of transparency creates enhanced trust. Lastly, and I think to me this is one of the most important pieces of this, everyone everywhere is able to transact in cryptocurrency. So that entrepreneur we were talking about in the Congo, who's squared away, he's got his website set up, he's got his whatever he's invented is up there. There's interest. He has his shipping squared away, but he has trouble like getting payments from customers who are using different currencies in their local countries. Now has a solution, right? He can accept cryptocurrency. He can accept Bitcoin, and that I think is really a game changer for the ability of people globally to actually participate fully in our global economy and our global financial system. Okay, that was all nice, very high-minded, very lovely, but how does it work? So let's get into a few interesting concepts here. The first concept is about fair play, right? Is about how we ensure that people can play fair in a group, even when they might have a selfish interest that would cause them to not play fair. So here's the problem, right? You and three other people at a table blindfolded with a $10 bill in the middle. If the bill is not on the table in 5 minutes, or sorry, if the bill is on the table in 5 minutes, everyone gets $5. If the bill is not on the table, everyone just leaves, no one's searched. What do you do? Right? Well, if you play this out, if you think through the various outcomes, there's an obvious outcome here that's like, if you believe that the only good interest is self-interest, you should just take the money, right? That's your motivation. There's a second interesting outcome, however, that if you believe anyone else at the table also believes that and will only act in their self-interest, you should also take the $10, right? Because you know someone else will first. If this is sort of an interesting mental exercise for you, if you like this, like figuring out sort of what are the incentives, what are the motivations, the general topic for this stuff is called game theory, and it's a really fascinating area about game design and incentives and trying to predict how people would or should operate in different scenarios. It's a really, really cool area. There's a lot of accessible literature on it, and it's another area that if it's interesting, I would encourage you to dive into. We're not here for a class on game theory, though. So the lesson here is that the only way a system like this can work is if it's in everyone's best interest to act for the common good. Right? And it turns out that's actually pretty hard to build. And this is one of Bitcoin's really interesting breakthroughs, is to find a way to create incentives in the system that push everyone to working for everyone else's good, even when there might be short-term incentives for people to cheat or to misbehave, right? Because there are other counter incentives. So how does Bitcoin do that? In answering this question, I am going to skip over a part of how Bitcoin works. I'm going to skip over the part where you have a transaction you want to send. You want to send 1 Bitcoin from you to someone else. And how does that transaction get from you to the network and eventually to the miners? I'm going to skip that part because it's not really relevant to this incentives discussion. But if you're interested in this, you can research what's called the Byzantine generals problem. That Byzantine is in Byzantine Empire. And it is another problem that Bitcoin solved along the way to becoming the first viable electronic cash. It's a really, really cool problem, very interesting. I'm going to stick in this discussion to how the Bitcoin blockchain, in particular, rewards sort of good behavior and how it's set up for fairness. So there are these people in the Bitcoin blockchain. They're called miners. These are participants in the blockchain whose job it is to take those transactions I talked about, right? I want to send 1 Bitcoin from me to someone else, and validate and make them permanent, right? That's their job in the protocol. Is they're there to say, yep, this transaction is valid and it is now enshrined forever on the blockchain. So why don't they just include transactions that send all the money to themselves, right? How does that work? Well, a few things. Number one, the miners compete among themselves for a right to validate transactions for a period in time, right? This competition, if you've done some blockchain research, this is sort of the proof of work part of this, right? Is that competition that these miners engage in to be the one that wins the right to validate transactions for a period of time. And they get a reward. They get Bitcoins for being the one that wins that competition. And they get a reward for including then those transactions we talked about, including them and validating them. Their interest then, if we think about miners, what do they want to do? What are we incentivizing them to do? Is to win as many competitions as possible and validate as many transactions as they can, so they maximize the amount of return that they get, right? They also want to ensure that these transactions remain fair and valid, so that people keep sending transactions into the blockchain, right? Because if miners started to be unfair or invalid, ignoring the other technical safeguards there, people wouldn't want to use the system. They wouldn't get mining rewards. The value of the currency would decline, and they would be shooting themselves in their long-term foot, even if there might be a very short-term incentive to do something bad, right? So if the miners then choose to act against those interests, they could potentially make some short-term money at the cost of destroying their long-term economic return, right? And these miners, to win this competition, to win the right the ability to validate these transactions, are spending a lot of money, right? This is not a cheap endeavor for them to engage in. So if we go back to our game with the $10 bill, right? Instead of grabbing the $10 bill or not, let's say instead we all vote, right? So that same $10 is on the table. We're all at the table. And we are all blindly voting whether or not we want to take the $10 bill or leave the $10 bill. If we vote to take it, then we all get $10 and the game ends. We all walk away. If we vote to leave it, the $10 stays there. We all get $1 and we play again, right? Majority rules. So whatever 51% or more of the group decides, we all do. This system of consensus, right, means that even if a few people are playing the game wanted to act on their immediate self-interest as opposed to their long-term self-interest, they would likely be overruled by a majority who can see that, well, I can earn infinite dollars just taking $1 at a time versus limiting myself to $10 this one time and never earning any more. Right? So those miners, going back to our miners, those miners, right, win those transactions, they publish them, right? Because what good is a blockchain and transactions if no one knows what the transaction was, right? So after that miner wins the competition, wins the right to validate transactions, they take some transactions that they're waiting for them, they put them in what's called a block. And here we start to see the origin of the term blockchain. They put them in a block and they publish them for all to see. In the same way that initial transaction was sent out and the miner learned about it, they use a very similar mechanism to push those blocks back out and say, here's a new block. Everyone should look at the transactions and these are now valid. And because that is true, because they publish it back out, then all of us can go look at the transactions that were put in those blocks, right? And we can go say, yep, this seems to be fair and valid. They're playing by the rules. This is all good, right? And so that's how then we, as users of this chain of blocks, if you will, so a little preview there, can hold the miners accountable right? Because we have transparency into what they're doing because they are forced to give us that transparency. As the miners build more and more blocks, those blocks are chained to each other, one after another, right? Hence, blockchain, a chain of blocks. Now, because these blocks are all connected, right? So one block is connected to the next block, is connected to the next blocks, and so on and so on. Because these are all connected, it means if you want to change a block over here in the past, you have to not only spend the effort, right? You have to basically redo all the effort that the original miner put in to win that competition. You have to not only do that for this block, but for every single block that follows and rewrite that entire history. The reason this is important is because it takes a lot of effort and work to do that. And it makes the blockchain hard to fake, hard to create counterfeits, if you will. And as the blockchain grows longer and lives longer, the transactions that were made before are just harder and harder and harder and harder to tamper with. And so we end up with a structure that lets us submit a transaction, right? I'm going to send blockchains from A to B, and this amount of money. Let that transaction sort of be publicly known. Have another party validate that transaction. Yep, that transaction follows the rules. You actually have that much money to send. You're sending it to an address that like makes sense, that kind of thing. That then fixes that transaction in time and says this transaction is validated and occurred in this block, and then secures that block so that it can't be tampered with in the future. And what you have there are the elements of something called a ledger. Right? A ledger is something in accounting that is used to record transactions in a book. And using a ledger, you can then build up a record of value across all these various accounts. Right? So going from this basic sort of set of incentives that we're building these miners, we can rebuild the ability to conduct global transactions quickly and with high assurance and transparency. But what else? What else could this thing be used for? I think that's an interesting thing to explore. So this is an interesting question, right? So if I were to tell you for $50, I would give you these autographed, game-worn, original Jordans, what would you want to know? And I'm pretty sure all of you are going to want to know, how do I know this is not fake? How do I know this isn't counterfeit? You're not ripping me off? And that's a really great question to ask. So another use for blockchains is to create a system that instead of tracking where value is transferred between people, right? I send 1 Bitcoin from me to that person, could track the travel of physical items or electronic in-game items from one person to another. So instead of just like sort of trying to take my word or like stare at the stitching on the shoe or like, you know, does the story hang together? In a future world, you could perhaps just look them up on an app and say, yep, this is, you know, pair number, 65 of 100 that were ever officially sold. And I can validate on the blockchain that these have the right, digital key signature built into them and are legitimate shoes. Same thing with an in-app item, right? So if you're playing a game and you see a Vorpal Sword of Doom drop after you kill a character in whichever game you like playing, one of the questions you can ask, right, is, well, the maker of this game says this is a super rare item, and so that should be pretty remarkable, but is it? I don't know. Well, let's go, now we can check, right? Because in a world where game makers were using something like a blockchain to record the creation and issuance of in-game artifacts like this, you could go look and see, yep, they said they generated 100 swords. I see 100 swords on the blockchain, and this is legit. And I got this thing. It's super, super cool. It can also enable things like then moving that item from one game to another, right? If you can prove that you own an in-game item in game number 1, then it should be possible to take that item to game number 2, as long as those game makers want to interoperate and say, well, I earned it here, but now I can prove I earned it on the blockchain, and I can use it here, right? That's pretty cool, and something that I would certainly enjoy playing around with. So, to wrap this up a bit, and then take some of your questions. I said at the beginning that I was gonna tell you what I was gonna tell you. I was gonna tell you, and then I was gonna tell you what I told you, right? And so I've done the first 2. Let's do the third now. So what did we do here today? Well, we discovered that what money is and what the core principles of money are. We then talked about some of the problems in the modern global exchange of value through the, that entrepreneur in the Congo who wants to sell to a global audience, and how that person could figure out how to do it, right, using cryptocurrency. And then we explored some of the other characteristics of cryptocurrency and a bit about how cryptocurrency works under the hood, right? And I've kept it fairly high level and a conceptual level. There's obviously a lot more depth to how cryptocurrency works. You notice I didn't say the word cryptography one time in this presentation, and cryptography is a huge element of how the blockchain works, how it functions securely and safely. And that is a great topic for you all to follow up on if this sort of sparks some curiosity and some interest. And look, the bottom line here for me is that for money to be useful in an increasingly global and interconnected world, I think we need money to satisfy the core tenets of value exchange, of measuring value, of a yardstick of value, and of storing value. And it needs to do it in a way that enables anyone, anywhere in the world, that has a great idea, talent, and the drive to be able to execute, to create and receive value. And fundamentally, this is the problem that I believe cryptocurrency addresses better than anything else we have today. And it's why I chose to spend time working